Chapter 40. Allow me to doubt you are listening at novel full. Audio. The invisible pressure that prevented them from breathing disappeared as suddenly as it had come. Jake took a deep breath to calm himself. Aslael may have looked and acted wacky, but his power was real. The time has come for me to abandon you. Aslael resumed peacefully. But before that, one last important thing to mention. You must search for the cubes. These technological gems are exclusive to the Oracle. No one knows how the Oracle system designs them. They come in many types and sizes. The one you absolutely must find if you want to become a player is the red cube. It will give you access to your first ordeal. As he said those words, his eyes lingered on Jake. Most cubes are accessible from the Oracle cities, but red and black cubes are numerous in the wild. The black cube is a teleporter. With enough ether to pay the travel expenses, it is your best chance to find your loved ones if they survive until then. On planet B842, all roads lead to Thelma. Despite these positive words, the morale of his audience was at an all-time low. Come on, don't pull that face. Aslael teased them with his shrill voice, undoubtedly delighted to see their faces so deflated. To be honest, you don't really have any goals to achieve. You can rot in here for all I care. No matter which way you go, as long as you can get some ether, you'll be all right. The Oracle device on your wrist is here to tell you how. It's not like you're on your own. In other words, we don't have a choice. We'll literally have to kill to survive, unless we can offer a service in exchange for lightning. Summarized the businessman with glasses. I'm sure these Oracle cities are full of opportunities for a businessman like me anyway. Not everyone shared his optimism. The other three middle-aged men were sweating profusely. Jake was already seeing them commit suicide before the end of the week, if they survived until then. The playboy also seemed terrified, but managed to keep a slightly relaxed, though slightly tense, smile on his face, probably to keep up with the 5 young women beside him. As for these young women, the voluptuous blonde watched the playboy's colt with almost hypnotic intensity. It was easy to guess what was going through her mind. Of the other 4 students, only one seemed calm. But it could have been terror. People all reacted differently to such a situation. Noel.N not very tall, no more than 1.60 m, generous shapes and a slender waist. Despite its very feminine forms, she seemed small and fragile to Jake. The first reason being that she was the youngest woman in the group, with barely 20 years on the clock. The second reason was that she was hiding behind the playboy, as if she didn't want to be noticed. She was also the only one wearing jeans, rather than a dress or mini-short. Unfortunately for her, her modesty might have been a drawback, as these skinny jeans were not known to be suitable for off-road trekking. Luckily she was wearing flat boots, where one of the other young women had had the bad idea to wear heels. As for her face, it was dazzling. A beautiful brown hair falling below her shoulders, with blue strands at the ends, probably the expression of a late adolescent revolt. Her eyes were of an ocean cyan color matching her hair color, her bewitching lips with the right amount of volume, her little nose slightly trumpet-shaped, matching impeccably with the rest. One could have reproached her for her pale skin, but the pink of her cheeks and the total absence of imperfection on the contrary gave her an aura of virginal purity. However, all the women in the group, both the young student and the mother of the child, wore mostly mid-season clothes despite the month of December. Tops, shirts or short dresses. The men were no different in this respect, except for the businessman who wore a suit. None of them had a jacket. Since everyone spoke English, even with the accents it was difficult to identify their country of origin with their Caucasian physique. With global warming the winters were milder and depending on the country the temperatures could be quite warm at that time. Seeing their outfits, Jake sighed mentally. With the ever-changing climates of this world, this group was in danger of having a tough day. There was even a good chance that they would perish, not from the monsters, but from cold, or thirst. But, well, none of that was his concern. As soon as the instructor finished his speech, he would leave. Only the child aroused his pity, but he had already gone through far too much mourning to be affected. He would leave it to fate. Speaking of the instructor, he would sweep his inquisitive gaze from person to person, sometimes giggling when he read an original thought or one that moved him. However, he did not always smile. When he stopped on Jake, the glow in his eyes would intensify and his expression would get harder. Then he would nod approvingly, before moving on to another person. The man in the suit was also entitled to this kind of consideration, as was the playboy or the young female student. From time to time, a compassionate expression would come over him when he was assessing the mother and child, but he would soon regain his amused neutrality. But for Jake, the message was clear. Aslael saw them as already dead. Jake coldly analyzed all the information revealed and immediately decided on his route plan. Forward to the red cube. According to the oracle, one of these cubes was not far away but in the opposite direction to the nearest oracle city. His plan, however, remained the same. Even if after his death battle against a digester LVL2 his ether and body stats had increased, he was just confident to handle only one digester of this level. A level 3 or a group of these creatures and he would literally gamble his life on a dice roll. The first ordeal would undoubtedly be a terrible challenge, but he would come out stronger and more importantly alive, since the oracle guaranteed their survival on the first 4 rounds. Aslael suddenly clapped his hands, which suddenly took Jake out of his inner monologue. He then realized that the instructor was simply applauding him. "You've got potential, kid, that deserves a little nudge. Here, take this." Jake grabbed the silver cubic object thrown at him by the trainer and put it away without looking or showing any change in expression. This sequence of events happened so fast that it seemed as if nothing had happened, but unfortunately the group was perfectly attentive and didn't miss any of the injustice. "Hey!" the playboy snarled, in a stirred-up tone. "Why does he get a gift and we don't? If he's as good as you say he is, his chances of survival are already better than ours." Then the rest of the group voiced their own feelings of injustice, with the exception of the man in the suit and the young woman, who remained silent, though they stared at the pocket in which Jake had put the silver cube. Seeing that Aslael continued to smile and look up at the sky as if he could not see them, the group turned their anger to the recipient of this attention, Jake. "Hey, let's see what you got." The playboy assaulted him, suddenly pointing his Colt at Jake. "Sorry, buddy, but there's no way we're letting you walk away with something that could save our lives. I'm not just thinking about myself here, I'm thinking about the rest of the group." Jake gave him a predatory look. It was only then that the playboy realized that the man in front of him, the man he had pointed his gun at, was an athlete with a ripped physique against whom he wouldn't stand a chance in single combat. The tangled hair, the shaggy beard, his eyes of embers, the machete in his right hand, the semi-automatic pistol stored in his belt. Everything about this man reminded him of a ferocious beast capable of crushing him like an insect. "What if I don't feel like it?" Jake replied nonchalantly, staring down at him. The playboy was terrified, but he couldn't back down now, his reputation depended on it. Taking a deep breath, he repressed the terror in his voice and forced himself to answer threateningly. "You will pay the consequences," he declared, raising the safety of his Colt to give credence to his words. The playboy looked to the women behind him for courage. Fatal mistake. At that moment, a sharp pain in the crook of his wrist made him drop the gun. The pain was so extreme that his vision blurred and tears came to his eyes. He could no longer feel his right hand. An oracle path beautifully executed. The fact that his two statuses combined gave him an explosive speed almost 3 times that of the average man must have played its part. "Allow me to doubt it," Jake simply replied, picking up the Colt, emptying its cylinder and handing him the gun and the 3 remaining bullets in his other hand. He then let go of his victim's twisted wrist, dusted off the playboy's white shirt, and went back to his seat as if nothing had happened. Chapter 41. Sit down and spread your legs. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The playboy stared at the inside of his wrist with an empty mind, asking himself all sorts of questions. He hadn't seen the man move. Just felt his wrist and thumb twist in a direction his joints weren't designed for. As the adrenaline subsided, a stabbing pain had taken over. The good news, however, was that despite being brutalized against his will, the savage had restrained himself. He was in pain, but he didn't have a fracture or a sprain. He realized that at no time had his tormentor let his guard down in their presence. He had always been prepared for the worst. A nervous laugh of acceptance invaded him. This time he had really lost face in front of his groupies. But at least he had learned a hard lesson. Never underestimate your enemies. Aslael hadn't budged from the beginning until the end of the confrontation. Seeing that the show was over, he began to give them some final advice. This gift may seem unfair, but it came from my own pocket. The Oracle doesn't do welfare. The instructor justified himself shamelessly. However, I'm in a good mood, so I'm going to do charity work for today. A ring of red light shone again from his own right wrist, and from it gleamed a handful of red crystals no bigger than peas. Enough to give one to each person. The crystals levitated up to them at face level, waiting to be caught. When Jake received his, he was able to confirm with his system that they were worth 1 strength ether point. He immediately absorbed the ether into his body, the crystal reverting back to a simple inert diamond which he stored in his bag. His strength ether stat now peaked at 13. Now that you are all ready, I wish you all good luck. Perhaps one day we will meet again. Before they could ask one more question, the clownish-looking instructor leapt into the beam of blue light and disappeared. Still, they were given a piece of advice they could have done without. Try to avoid dying too soon. Aslael's voice sounded one last time before the blue light beam went out for good, plunging the top of the snowy hill on which they were standing into darkness and silence, plunging the temperature by several degrees. After the light beam disappeared, the brightness dropped several notches. Even though it was past noon at the most according to Jake's estimate and the sky was empty of clouds, the contrast had still made him lose his bearings. It took a minute for his pupils to get used to the daylight. When he could see properly again, he picked up his package, woke Crunch up, and started striding down the hill without giving a glance to the group of doomed people behind him. The playboy, and most of the group behind him, sighed with relief as he left, happy to get off so lightly. Especially the playboy for threatening him with his Colt. At least he would remain the leader of this group as long as he had a few bullets left. There were still 9 bullets available, plus the 3 that the stranger had unloaded from the barrel of his Colt before returning it to him. One might wonder why a young man would carry a gun and so many spare bullets in a shopping mall before being transported back here. The answer was simple. He wasn't smart, but savvy enough to notice how quickly the order had degenerated after the Oracle devices appeared. However, even before he regained his customary arrogance, he heard. "Wait!" yelled a shallow voice, but loud enough to reach Jake's ear. He stopped walking and turned halfway around to stare at the woman who had called out to him. The youngest woman in the group was facing him. She had run behind him to catch him. Not far behind her, however, stood the man in the suit with glasses. The young woman's heart was pounding, afraid to talk to this demon armed to the teeth. At least that's how she saw him, so impressed had he been when he had disarmed the playboy. On the contrary, the man in the suit remained calm, but there was an expectation in his eyes. "What is it?" Jake asked quietly, his expression totally neutral, neither friendly nor hostile. He could hardly imagine that a few months earlier he was unable to hold his gaze with a woman his age. He was still socially awkward, but emotionally he was now completely detached. Although she feared that he would ignore her, when he replied she was so surprised that she forgot what she wanted to ask him. You. She babbled, trying to pull herself together. But her efforts proved futile. Fear held her and prevented her from reasoning normally. Fortunately, the man in the suit came to her rescue, like a hero from heaven to save the damsel in distress. I think what she wants to ask is, may I come with you? Of course my question is the same. He affirmed, putting his glasses back on in a gesture probably repeated thousands of times. Taking another look at the young woman, he saw the relief in her posture when she managed to convey her message, even though someone else had said it for her. Nevertheless, Jake did not intend to accept this easily. He did not have time to deal with two burdens. However, he was not immoral either, even though he did not intend to sacrifice himself for strangers. In a world where risk and courage were rewarded, one could not survive simply by seeking the protection of the strong. You had to become strong yourself. And if those two people didn't have that ambition in them, he wouldn't accept them. Why? He simply asked, staring at each of them in turn with an inquisitive gaze. Because. Because you're strong. She replied in a determined tone. I'll have a better chance of surviving if I can follow you. I promise, I won't ask for anything, I'll just follow you, I'll learn to survive quietly without making any noise. But if I stay in the other group I've never been scouting or hiking or camping after all. Frankly, I won't last 2 days on my own, and I have enough sense to know they don't know any better than I do. I reckon that's an acceptable answer. Jake agreed after weighing the pros and cons. What about you? He asked, turning his attention to the gentleman in the suit. What about me? The businessman retorted with an air of defiance. Isn't it obvious? As the lady said so well, you only have to look at me to know that I have no experience of survival in the wilderness, and sure enough, neither do the others. Besides, it doesn't take a genius to understand that when the other fool runs out of bullets, the first digester we come across will eat us alive. Like her, I understand that you're not a Samaritan. Nothing is free in this world like in ours. You mustn't forget that I'm a businessman first and foremost, and a good one at that. My wallet can attest to that. Saying this, he pulled out a wad of bills before tearing them up and throwing them in the snow, knowing that this money would not be of much use in this world. The playboy, like the rest of the group, were too far away to hear what he was saying, but they felt a twinge of sadness when they saw him squandering all that money. I guess that answer will do the trick, too. Jake approved. Before we get started, here are my rules. They're non-negotiable. First, I can teach you how to fish, but you get no fish from me. Second, if you slow me down, I won't hesitate to give you up. Third, I advise you to get rid of those clothes the first chance you get. In case you haven't noticed, the climate, like the temperatures here, is not stable. And those jeans. They'll slow me down. The young woman swallowed when she heard him mention it. Indeed, her tight jeans had a small range of motion and were irritating her inner thighs. The hours of walking that had taken her to the top of the hill had left their marks. Her inner thighs were on fire and blood, and she had struggled hard to climb with such inflexible jeans, not to mention the cold that did not help. With her sleeveless top, she had been shivering for quite a while. If she hadn't already caught a cold, it wouldn't be long now unless she climbed off that hill soon. A knife plunged into the snow right in front of her feet, which made her jump and make a cute squeaking sound. Make sure it doesn't slow me down. Jake commanded, always in a neutral tone, not tolerating discussion. Same thing for Williams Hopkins, but you can call me Will. The man in the suit introduced himself in a formal tone. Nice to meet you, Will. Will, these shoes might slow us down too and hurt you if they don't already. Unfortunately, I don't have a viable solution at the moment, so you two have to deal with it, but equally, don't slow me down. That goes without saying. William confirmed without showing the slightest sign of weakness. He understood the rules of the game. What was the value of 1 or 2 blisters against life? Meanwhile, the young woman contemplated the knife, still wondering what she was supposed to do with it. Seeing this, Jake sighed a long sigh. He walked over to her, picked up the knife, and ordered. Sit down and spread your legs. Chapter 42 Departure. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Seeing the terrified reaction of the young woman and the shocked look on Will's face, he realized how much the words chosen were open to interpretation. However, the damage was done, and he really wanted her to sit down and spread her legs. Don't you understand what I just said? He repeated, this time with a frown, which ended up chilling the young woman. Yielding to the impulse, she sat down and spread her legs hesitantly, red as a peony. More than that, insisted Jake, totally indifferent to the embarrassment. After a while, the young woman finally decided to accede to his request and spread her legs wide enough for him to be satisfied. When he was about to do his work, he was interrupted by a voice that he did not want to hear at all. Hey, keep your filthy hands off her, you monster! The playboy roared, coming fast with the Colt in his hand. Reloaded this time, behind him, the rest of the group followed, fierce expressions on their faces. Even for cowards like them, there was still a bottom line not to be crossed, otherwise they would have lost their humanity long ago. Extremely dissatisfied with being interrupted, Jake threw a mocking dig. Here's one who hasn't learned his lesson. Jake grumbled as he stood up, knife still in hand. Need a wake-up shot. At these words, the playboy lost all his courage, and unconsciously took a step backwards. Jake then knelt down again, bent down with his knife, began to tear the young woman's jeans, then nothing. What he had to do was done. The young woman, who had closed her eyes, totally convinced that her most precious thing was going to be taken from her, opened them again with a deeply lost look on her face, trying to understand why nothing had happened. Silly girl, Jake commented, before putting the knife away to finally get going again. Realizing that she would not be desecrated in the snow by a stranger, she began to tremble, half laughing, half sobbing. Gradually regaining her usual phlegm, she looked at her crotch. A cross had been drawn with a knife in the most intimate part of her person, opening the jeans halfway down her thigh, where her underwear could be seen. When she saw this, she shamefully tightened her legs and immediately began to run behind the frightening man, before he got too far ahead of her. Fashion or survival, she had made her choice. In any case, she noticed that the jeans no longer hindered her movements. He had also slashed the fabric in other strategic places, such as in the crook of her thighs or knee, so that she wouldn't be hindered in her movements. She was surprised at his speed and precision, but if she had Jake's stats before her very eyes, she would have understood better why it seemed so simple to him. Amy, where are you going? The playboy asked, puzzled at her decision. He barely knew her from college. She was one of the new friends recently introduced by his procession of groupies, but it was clear that their friendship had no solid basis. Leaving you. Will enlightened him. Don't take this personally, but I trust him more than I trust your Colt. Goodbye. Without further ado, the businessman started trotting behind the young lady. As for the playboy, he glanced at the group of people behind him, probing their reaction. He was worried for nothing. The majority seemed relieved to see them leave except for the child. As for the young women who should have been Amy's friends, an expression of contempt was on their faces. They would not abandon him anytime soon. Sarah, wasn't she your friend? The playboy asked, confused. The 20.5-year-old blonde woman uttered a haughty HMFF in reply. Just a new girl looking for friends. We weren't going to leave her alone, especially such a pretty girl. But then, we have to be honest, she didn't have much in common with us. She didn't talk much, just followed us around, but you could tell she was bored. I guess it was bound to happen. But I wouldn't have thought she'd leave us to go off with that savage. Look at him. You can tell right away that he's a criminal or some kind of psychopath. You saw it right there, Kyle. If you hadn't come, he probably would have deflowered her in front of us. Huh, good point. Good thing I was there. The playboy self-flattered, although deep down he thought it didn't really look like an attempted. Even more profoundly, he even thought that if the threatening man had wanted to her in front of them, he would have done so regardless of the Colt pointed at him. Just thinking about it gave him shivers down his spine. He was careful not to contradict Sarah, however. After all, up to now she had been his most faithful follower, and they shared much more than just friendship. Still, they couldn't be said to be alike. Sarah's friends had all shared his bed at one time or another, but that he would refrain from telling her. Only Amy had escaped that fate, but after all she was new to the group. "So what do we do?" asked Sophie, another one of his groupies, a brunette who had abused tanning beds and was always all tarted up. "You heard the clown," sardonically replied Sarah. "According to my oracle, the nearest shelter is in the direction we appeared. We can take this opportunity to return to the mall that was transported with us to replenish our supplies. There we try to hunt what we can for the ether or join a larger group. You don't think Kyle's Colt can shoot forever, do you?" The interested party made an irritated growl, but he did not contradict her. He agreed with her, but did not dare to give his opinion for fear of being seen as a coward. He wanted to join an Oracle City, but with the number of digesters lurking in the way, it was suicide. The instructor had made it clear what kind of fate the Oracle had in store for the civilians. As for them, they planned to go there immediately without any ether reserve except for one red crystal each. Clearly not a bright idea, considering that half of their group had been decimated by digesters on this very path. So without saying a word, the group set off, cautiously huddled around a young man, a playboy holding a Colt. Meanwhile, Jake had come halfway down the hill. The temperature was already rising, and he had already put away his jacket and scarf. Far from ensuring that the young woman and the man named Will was following, he walked towards a hardwood forest that he had spotted at the top when he checked the path to the red cube. The advantage was that he would have a clearer view than in the dominant tropical jungle to the left of his position. Assuming he was heading north, assuming because the compasses didn't work here, the hardwood forest was to the northeast and the jungle to the northwest. His starting point on B842 was to the south. The Oracle City was to the west. The mapping feature on his wristband had automatically calibrated the cardinal points on his arbitrary decision. Now that he had some time to contemplate the map established by the system, he realized how valuable this feature was. He also took the opportunity to take out the silver cube. The silver cube was only slightly larger than a dice, but warm to the touch and pulsating with a faint glow similar to that of a night light. Ednel.co, what's that for? Jake asked his trusty AI, who had been silent all along. What's the matter with you? Over time, Jake had learned to recognize when his AI was confused, amused, or in a bad mood. She was definitely out of sorts. This Aslael. He hasn't changed. She sighed wanly. That was the only confession she made. After that, whatever Jake tried to pull at her, she remained silent. Finally, he resolved to ask her his original question again. A silver cube is used to store encoding programs for ether. It can store other data, but that would be a waste. Knowing Aslael's character, this one should come in handy. To use it, you just need to place it against your Oracle device, and the cube will be integrated into it. And indeed, the integration process went off without a hitch. He concentrated mentally to make his bracelet appear, then put the silver cube on it. The silver cube then dissolved like a sugar lump falling into a hot coffee pot. A short moment later, a system prompt notified him of the success. New encoded ether unlocked. Hardening and sharpening. Cost: 5 ether for 1 hardening and sharpening ether point. Jackpot. He didn't have to worry about his machete and knives anymore. As long as they didn't break, his weapons had good hope of becoming real killing machines in the future. Chapter 43 Tasting Session. You are listening at novelfull.audio. This new encoded ether was reassuring, as it gave a future to Earth weapons. It may not have been noticeable since they were still weak, but when the average opponent became stronger and faster than the steel of a bullet, the time for weapons would be over. He had no doubt that more advanced weapons existed, but were they so easily accessible? Moreover, from what he understood, unless he lost his ether-reinforced weapons, the ether could be retrieved and transferred. Therefore, he also had to beware of people's greed. The moment unscrupulous thugs realized that his weapon contained ether, Jake would become a target. As he finished scanning the data about the new type of ether, William and Amy joined him at the bottom of the hill. They were out of breath, having obviously run to keep him in sight and clearly lacking training. "Any questions?" he asked calmly. "What are we going to do now?" Will replied, massaging his feet. He had taken the opportunity to take off his shoes while Jake let them catch their breath, and blisters were indeed developing. Soon the blisters would follow. "We're heading to a red cube to participate in the first ordeal, while facing whatever is within our reach to acquire ether and strengthen ourselves. Finding food and water would not be a bad idea either." "Sounds good to me." Will nodded. "On the other hand, if the three of us are going to go for a walk together in the next few days, I suppose it would be good form for all three of us to know each other's first names. What do you say?" "William Hopkins, if memory is already failing you, at your service." Jake was slightly unsettled by Will's bluntness. When was the last time he'd given his name to anyone? Since the party at Paul's, perhaps. He wasn't sure anymore. But maybe he was an anomaly, and a lot of people like Will had continued to interact with people until the last day. "All right. My name is Jake Wildearth." "Wildearth, funny last name." Will carelessly commented. "It's a very old family name." Jake didn't care much about his family except for his uncle and cousin, but knowing them, some of them should have survived. The Wildearths were all gifted. If he wasn't a notorious procrastinator and socially awkward, his life would have been very different. "I see." Will replied, seeing nothing at all. "My name is Amanda Allen, but everyone calls me Amy." The young woman, who hadn't said a word all along, introduced herself. "Nice to meet you, Amy." Will replied, politely. "Nice to meet you." Jake added. "Well, now that the introductions are made, I suggest we hit the road for good. I have no intention of spending the night here." Hearing this, Will sighed long and hard, then put his leather shoes back on, pulling a grimace on his face before getting back on his feet, ready to go. As for Amy, she wore comfy boots, and the embarrassing operation on her jeans had paid off. She was no longer restricted in her movements. On the contrary, she couldn't wait to get going, as the cold on the hill had chilled her to the bone. Moving into the unknown, Will and Amy followed in Jake's footsteps, a ball of excitement and fear in their tummies, convinced that what lay ahead of them looked bleak, but that at least they would have the chance to survive a little longer, and maybe even live. The group walked at a brisk pace for almost an hour before reaching the edge of the forest. The foliage of the deciduous trees was now partially masking the sky, and the atmosphere had quickly become more anxious. All that could be heard were the group's restrained breaths, and except for Jake, who was displaying a quiet vigilance, the other two were turning around frequently, jumping at the slightest suspicious noise. From time to time Jake would stop abruptly and then start up again as if nothing had happened, which made them miss a heartbeat. Sometimes he would kneel down next to a grass, a flower or a fruit that seemed unusual to him, observe it from every angle, taste it, and depending on his diagnosis, ignore it again or, on the contrary, pick it up and put it away in his huge hiking bag. It must be said that the bracelet had enormously simplified his assessment of the edibility or otherwise of the surrounding flora. All he had to do now was taste the plants in infinitesimal quantities, and then consult the status of his health immediately afterwards. The device indicated the presence of poison in the body, where potential harmful effects at higher doses. Since many drugs are also poisons at a certain dose, as are some vital nutrients such as sugar and salt, the status obviously did not indicate a poisoned status at such a low dose. It was Jake, who interpreted the variations in his vital signs to make a judgment. Of course, it didn't tell him everything, but it did save him valuable time, since all he had to do was get a fraction of the sample into his bloodstream to determine its impact. Once he had become familiar with this hidden function of the statute, he was increasingly able to interpret these values. The fact that with his new statistics, his IQ was close to 180, 16.1 times 1.1 is equal to 17.71, was no doubt a factor. Why did he need to identify the plants, when he had been preparing for the worst for 3 months, so much so that he knew as much as the average herbalist? Simply because nothing was ever simple. In the same way that humans and animals had had their etheric code modified when they arrived on B842, plants had benefited from the same treatment. And even if this was not the case, the ether generated by the atmosphere would affect them sooner or later. Moreover, there were certainly plants that did not exist on Earth around him. Just as the digesters were born out of the atmosphere of the mirror universe, perhaps more plant-like beings were born in the same way. More simply, they were perhaps portions of forest belonging to a universe other than his own. Apart from the common plants and trees of his world, which he recognized, he was content to collect only those he did not know and which had been permeated by the ether. By consuming them, his own ether did not evolve, but he enriched his database in the logbook. He had decided to ignore Earth's plants because he was aware that at the scale of B842 they were too rare, and not necessarily interesting compared to what ether's impregnated flora had to offer. It was better to just identify the plants that he had a chance of encountering anywhere on this planet. He had identified several edible plants, one whose tuber was similar to a sweet potato, except that the flesh was pink and the taste slightly spicy, but at least they wouldn't starve anytime soon. Bedo dem according to the bracelet, this pink potato had a powerful antioxidant power, an ideal nutritional profile and significantly accelerated recovery, as did virtually everything he had tested so far. Ether seemed to be a real panacea. In fact, he had also solved the mystery of why his ribs healed so quickly. The silvery blood he had consumed was literally like an elixir of youth. Following its consumption, cell replication was strongly accelerated and the genome was deeply reworked, renewing its capital of stem cells. The flesh had a similar, but less pronounced effect. He had mentally remembered that the next time he met one of his monsters, he would leave nothing to the vultures, not even the bones. The most surprising thing was that the digester didn't have such great vitality, otherwise it would have been impossible to kill. For this blood to be so powerful there had to be other properties at work. It's because digesters are born from the ether. She intervened. Their blood continues to attract the surrounding ether after their death. Which means that when you consume it, the flow of ether through your body is greater. But it's temporary. Will and Amy watched his antics without saying a word, understanding his intentions. They too had checked their wristband, but they didn't understand the ether's workings as well since their rank was still 0. Despite Aslael's explanations, the encode, compress and ether storage functions were inaccessible to them. Even if they had been able to use the red crystal immediately to increase their ether strength by 1 point and check their ether status, their options were limited. It was still a nice gift, though. Basically, it was too late to quietly do the small, opportunistic missions of the coaching feature. In order to get to rank 1, they had to kill a digester. Amy couldn't take it anymore, and ended up asking the question, ahead of Will, who was not far from cracking either. The bracelet gives you the effect of what you're tasting. Jake simply replied, before identifying a new white grass, covered with red cloudy patches. Bad luck, the grass was edible, but infected, leaving a carrion taste in his mouth. At first they kept a lost expression, then after a while the illumination took place and they started to collect and taste plants in their turn. Unfortunately, because of Amy's purse and Will's work case, they had nothing to store their finding and they were soon overloaded. Chapter 44 Private You are listening at novelfull.audio. After 2 long hours of harvesting, the sun had long since passed its zenith and the foliage in the heart of the forest was thicker than ever, clearly diminishing the luminosity. Jake wondered how there could be suns orbiting B842. Were the stars being absorbed at the same time to form a few huge stars, or were there other secrets behind this phenomenon? He didn't have time to meditate on this question any further because at that very moment a shrill whimper brought him out of his torpor. Recognizing this sinister war shriek, he adopted the posture of a soldier on the lookout. Slowly he laid down his pack, pulled out his machete and his semi-automatic, before crouching down silently. Will and Amy didn't dare make a sound either, knowing that a tiny mistake on their part would send them to the cemetery. In their previous group, nearly half of them had been murdered by one of these creatures. As for Crunch, who until now had been peacefully chewing on some alien catnip, he waddled at full speed to his master in search of a safe position. For a former alley cat, and with the help of his oracle, he had developed good self-preservation instincts. Focusing his attention on the noise, Jake cautiously observed the translucent monster coming out of the bushes. This digester was about a head smaller than he was and much less threatening and muscular than the one he had faced. The creature was on all fours rather than standing, although its morphology indicated that it could surely use bipedalism. The chitin on its lower legs was paler and less robust, the metal ends of its arms did not change shape incessantly, now resembling two scythes, and the white glow in its eye was less sustained. To top it all off, it looked more stupid, displaying the rich expression of a sea anemone. Taking no chances, Jake calmly aimed at the creature's eye and fired. The bullet passed easily through the eye of the creature, piercing half of its skull in the process. The digester fell dead into the ferns and a small flash of ether appeared above the remains. Surprised by this easy victory, he burst out laughing, which shocked his two companions, who had not seen him express any emotion since they had met him. But there, without a doubt, there was joy on his face. And they understood that emotion. After all, this same creature had slaughtered half of their previous group, and watching as Jake got rid of it, it looked so weak. Jake then proceeded to compress and absorb the ether, and not directly this time. After absorption his ether storage was back up to plus 1.6 points. His authority experience gauge was now around 6,800/10,000, 1600 more than before. The correlation between ether gains and experience was obvious. He decided to keep his ether in order to increase his possibilities. If he invested his ether points in strength whenever he could, he felt that he would sooner or later pay the price for this imbalance. Even if strength ether was encoded so that the power was usable, that is, without harming himself, it did not mean that it could supplant constitution ether. For example, even a normal human could strike with all his might into a lead wall, but he would surely injure his hand. Similarly, if he became strong enough to leap 20 meters high, the landing would probably be fatal. Amy and Will were torn between relief and jealousy. They watched the process without saying a word, but there was a certain envy on their faces. Too bad they weren't capable of accomplishing such a feat. Resuming their progression, the shrill cackling became more frequent and more insistent. They were heading towards what appeared to be a nest, but clearly Jake had no intention of turning back, much to Amy and Will's chagrin. It wasn't that he didn't want to. The problem was that no path was safer according to his oracle device. Since their arrival on B842, the oracle was not foolproof anymore because it couldn't predict the digester's movements. However, this was without relying on the oracle's ingenuity. Each living being equipped with an oracle represented as many different eyes for the system. Jake didn't know it, but the trees and shrubs all carried an oracle device on B842. While not perfect, it made the prediction function pretty much workable. After a few minutes, what they feared happened. 3 digesters identical to the one who had just died surrounded them, coming out of nowhere out of the tall grass. They loved tall grass and ferns, Jake realized. Everything he had encountered so far had ambushed him as he stepped out of one of those grasses. It was probably to protect them from other, more threatening predators, or it was a hunting method they were fond of. Shooting the one near Amy and Will with a bullet in the skull, he monopolized the attention of the other 2 by rushing towards them, machete in hand. The targeted digester straightened up on his hind legs, suddenly becoming as tall as Jake, and then shot his two scythes, which served as arms on him, in a manner similar to a rabid gorilla pounding the ground. Far from being agitated, Jake spotted a gap in the monster's guard and cut off one of the arms with a satisfied look, before suddenly diving down to avoid the scythe of the second monster, which had joined them. The pain of having his arm ripped off made the injured digester scream, hurting the eardrums of all three humans. How was I supposed to know they were that pissed off when you didn't finish them off on the first try? Jake cursed, clenching his teeth because of the pain in his ears. Determined to silence the creature once and for all, he spun around, then charged and jumped, decapitating the monster with an almost invisible movement of his machete. The digester's head fell to the ground, a stream of silvery blood spurting from the monster's neck. The second monster uttered a shrill cry of rage, but it was too late. Using the monster's carcass to conceal himself, Jake impaled the creature with his weapon, wounding it mortally. He then chopped off its head in turn. Seeing the three dead bodies on the ground, Jake mentally noted that the fight had been much harder than expected. He was risking his life here. He couldn't afford to underestimate the creatures of this world. He also realized that absorbing the ether from a digester LVL2 directly had indeed affected his personality. When they confronted these digesters, he was deadly calm from beginning to end. To be quite honest, he had enjoyed it. Anyway, if the side effects were limited to that, it was almost a good thing considering that fear and indecision had no place here. He just had to be careful with those symptoms. Jake then absorbed the ether for a total of 4,600 experience points and 4.6 ether points, raising his oracle grade to rank 2 and his ether storage to plus 6.2. Authority level. Private, rank 2, 0/100,000, no new features appeared to have been unlocked, but he would have to ask Shi for more details when the situation was calmer. The military rank was intriguing, but private was still a ridiculously low grade in every culture he knew. In any case, for more promotions and he'd have his diplomatic immunity for good. He felt more confident now to face a digester LVL2 like the one he had faced when he arrived on B842. 6 ether points could be converted into 6 strength ether or 3 agility ether points. In both cases, his combat prowess would be propelled to the next stage. This time Amy and Will's jealousy was physically palpable, but he ignored them. He had already told them he wouldn't help them. However, he was not unfair either. Realizing that they couldn't accomplish anything with their bare hands, he began to dissect the three monsters this time, under the disgusted gaze of his two fellow travelers. The silver scythes at the end of their arms looked like the blades of a saber. Almost 70 centimeters long, double-edged, with a sturdiness and appearance comparable to steel, the quality of these were indisputable. Sectioning the arms where the scythes stopped, he then took care of making suitable handles. Extracting the femurs from the three creatures, it took him almost an hour just to separate them from the carcass and then cleanse them of the monster's flesh and other bodily fluids. Beginning to understand what he was trying to accomplish, Amy and Will watched the procedure with interest, curiosity overriding the anguish that the shrill cackles around them continued to fuel. As for Crunch, he hadn't lost his mind either. The cat was enjoying a good raw leg of digester, completely indifferent to the bloody show his master was responsible for. The difference wasn't perceptible yet, but with every bite the cat grew and his eyes sparkled with a little more intelligence, which consequently helped him to better follow the advice of his oracle device. Its overall size was little affected yet, but its claws were already much sharper, capable of causing serious lacerations. Chapter 45 Change of Plans. You are listening at novelfull.audio. With his knife, Jake patiently ripped out bone shavings to shape the femurs, then split the upper heads in half about 6 inches deep so that the scythes could be inserted inside. Luckily, he had extra strong glue and heavy-duty tape that he used to hold the scythes to the femurs that served as the handles for these improvised weapons. He then used this same tape to wrap the handles to thicken them and soften the grip. Until leather straps were available, this would be enough to make them comfortable to use. Once his work was completed, Jake made a few moves in the air with his new weapons before handing these improvised machetes or short sabers to Amy and Will for them to try them out. The comfort was okay, but the scythes were heavier than he imagined. Probably that's why these digesters were having trouble standing upright. The first monster that almost caused his demise didn't seem to have any trouble standing up. He hoped with all his heart that the first digester he had met was an anomaly in this area, because an ambush by 3 monsters like that would not end so well. That was the difference between level 1 and level 2. "Do the handles fit you?" asked Jake courteously. "I can make them a little thicker with the scotch I have left, but you'll have to get used to the weight." "That's great," Will complimented, thumb up. He was already having the time of his life with his saber, trying to mimic Jake's spectacular moves and those from the action movies he'd watched. As for Amy, she was having a hard time wielding the blade with her tiny arms, but you could tell that she was relieved at the thought of no longer being unarmed in the face of these monsters. While they were discovering their new toys, Jake collected the monsters' usable blood, filling all of his vials to the brim. He left the meat behind, not short of food for the moment. He would have collected the hides to make leather, but it took much more time than he had at his disposal. And if he was going to do that, he might as well use a higher-level digester. He then made 2 more sabers, which he tied to his pack, and then set off again. The sun was beginning to set and the light was seriously running out. Yellow suns were slowly giving way to purple moons. Unfortunately, the strident cackling was becoming more frequent and increasingly close, confirming the sad hypothesis that these digesters were also hunting at night. They would not be able to rest until they left this forest or found an adequate shelter. But just as they were about to experience an infernal night, another group of humans led by a playboy were enduring another kind of hell, which would lead them to make a desperate decision. "Hey Kyle, are you sure we're on the right track?" the blonde named Sarah asked, anxiously sweeping the ferns around. "Of course I am," the playboy confirmed in a sarcastic tone. "You see that track by that rock over there? There should be the rest of one of my cartridges from when I shot the monster." The child who had dropped his mother's hand gambled near the rock and actually found the cartridge after a few minutes of searching. "I have it!" he exclaimed, proud of his finding. "Come back here, Tim," his mother shouted in a tired voice. She was the oldest in the group and all that walking had exhausted her, not to mention the fact that she had a child to protect. "Thanks, kid." Kyle congratulated him awkwardly, exasperated deep inside. "Unfortunately, an empty shell doesn't make a bullet. You can dump it back where you found it. But at least we have confirmation that we're on the right track. If I'm not mistaken, we should be able to find the mall where we appeared at the end of this wood. I'm sorry I doubted you." Sarah apologized in a not so sorry tone. Don't worry. Everyone's a bit on edge here." "Not without reason," one of his groupies mumbled. "True." The group progressed silently, no longer daring to doubt the playboy's sense of orientation. Indeed, after a quarter of an hour, they left the wood in question, arriving in a sort of clearing, including a portion of the mall in which they had been when they were transported on B-842. Nevertheless, the building remained voluminous, with a size approaching that of a football stadium, comprising 6 floors, the first of which included a hypermarket selling all sorts of foodstuffs and utilities. Jackpot! Kyle congratulated himself when he saw the rest of the mall. Most of the hypermarket had been preserved, which meant they wouldn't run out of food for a long time. This made an ideal base, giving them time to find other survivors and find a way to harvest ether easily. Once in front of the building, the group cautiously went through the automatic door, which was still working, probably thanks to a backup generator. As a result, even the fresh and frozen food had hope of remaining consumable for a while, until the generator also ran out of battery power. Enchanted, they rushed to the sections of their choice, picking the food they longed for right off the shelves. The child's laughter echoed through the store as he happily ate pastries behind the empty bakery, while his mother reminded him to chew enough before swallowing, with a slight smile on her lips. The young women in the group went to the sanitary department instead, raiding the intimate hygiene shelves, aware that such an opportunity would not arise again any time soon. The three cowardly-looking men, who until now had been rather discreet, took the opportunity to go to a sports shop to exchange their shorts and flip-flops for more off-road clothing. The playboy, inspired by them, did exactly the same thing, getting rid of his jeans and suede shoes in exchange for comfortable jogging shoes and sneakers. It was no longer time to show off. Soon the whole group had exchanged their summer clothes for more suitable ones. They then began to visit all the shops one by one, the majority of which were of no use in ensuring their survival in this post-apocalyptic world. A few hours earlier, they would have been delighted to be able to freely use the latest computers and smartphones, but now these objects were less valuable than a bottle of fresh water. Taking the escalator to the second floor, the group dispersed again to explore the building. Outside, the suns had begun to descend and the light was gradually fading. However, with the neon lights in the mall and the lack of windows, the group of humans did not notice the change. The exploration of the second floor went smoothly, as did that of the third floor, and with the exception of a toy store, which amazed the child, and many clothing boutiques, they did not find anything significant. On the fourth floor, they shouted with joy, discovering a large furniture sign. There were fitted kitchens, exhibition bathrooms, but above all bedrooms and beds, solving the question of where they would sleep that night. Unfortunately, it was at this very moment that the situation took a sudden turn, leading them straight to hell. As the group dispersed again inside the shop, looking for the bed in which they would sleep, shrill clattering sounded next to them. A few seconds later, a scream of suffering shattered their calm, instantly transforming their ephemeral euphoria into icy terror. The playboy jumped out of bed as if he'd been lying on a thumbtack, then shakily drew his Colt out, before racing off outside the store. He wasn't the only one with the same idea, his groupies were on his heels. Even the mother and child had reacted on the spot and followed them closely. As they approached the escalator to hurtle down the stairs, a translucent creature blocked their path, pouncing on them scythes in front. Kyle managed to dive in time, but one of the young women wasn't so lucky and was literally eviscerated before their eyes, her screams of agony provoking horrified retches from the survivors. Jenny. Another young woman sobbed when she saw her friend being mauled, but Sarah grabbed her by the arm firmly, pulling her towards the escalator. "It's over, there's nothing more you can do for her," she cried out without showing any mercy. Nothing was more important to her than her own life. Dragging her friend, they set off again, along with the playboy, the mother and the child. When they reached the ground floor, they heard another scream of suffering, this time male, and then nothing. None of the three men in their 40s had escaped the monsters. At least they thought they had, for as they were about to escape through the automatic entrance door they heard hurried footsteps, then a "Wait for me. Don't let me rot here." A balding man no longer of prime youth cried out with a gasping voice. He was one of the three men they thought were dead. By some miracle, he had managed to escape from the digesters, taking advantage of the fact that the monsters were munching his friends to take the escalator behind them. However, the shrill cackles resounded again and it was the trigger that reminded them that they didn't really have time to dither. The digesters were eating rather quickly and were not satisfied with their meager meal. The group ran without turning around until they lost their breath. After what seemed like an endless time, when the shrill cackles were long gone, they stopped, overcome by fatigue and lack of oxygen. The adrenaline was fading and the aftermath of their Olympic-style cavalcade was already beginning to be felt. They would be in horrible pain within a few hours. When they caught their breath, Kyle looked at the rest of the group. There were only 7 of them left. They had lost 3 people in the attack. He didn't care about the deaths of the 2 men, but Jenny's death had affected him. After all, they shared many sexual adventures together in the past, and despite the fact that she was stupid, she was a good friend. The other young women were also mourning the loss of their friend, with the exception of Sarah, who gazed at him with a look saying, "Now what do we do?" "How should I know?" was plastered on the playboy's lost face as an answer. "I want us to go back to the big, scary man." The child whined, with a face full of tears. "I'm sure even the monsters are afraid of him. When they say the truth comes out of the mouths of children. Or the oracle." They felt lost, and even if he didn't like the solution, it was there in front of him, and it was a child who found it. Going back to that psychopath. Remembering his altercation with the man in question, a shiver ran down his spine. Nevertheless, Kyle agreed with the child's reasoning. Having experienced his skills and temper, there was no doubt that these monsters, or at least the ones they had met, were no match for him. He might be overestimating this person, but it showed how much this man had left a deep impression on him. "It is indeed the only solution we have left," the playboy reluctantly declared. Sarah wasn't thrilled with the idea, but she couldn't think of anything more promising than this one. Their oracle devices had clearly not included these digesters in their predictions. The adjusted path was uncertain and recommended them to retrace their steps. As for the rest of the group, they approved the idea without flinching. They were simply drained and tired of all the ups and downs they had experienced today. Tired, but too nervous and anxious to rest, the group set off again at dusk, retracing their steps in order to find the man they had hoped to never meet again. Chapter 46 Battle Under the Purple Moons. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The night had fallen. The shrill cackles were now ubiquitous, forming a symphony of disgraceful squeals around them. Jake had kept his trusty machete and semi-automatic pistol in his hands, while Amy and Will clutched the guard of their improvised sabers with all their might. They knew that Jake couldn't fully protect them this time and that they would have to defend their lives on their own. Fortunately, their new weapons were a game-changer and they no longer felt so helpless against these creatures. "Stay close to me," Jake ordered as he began to run. Amy and Will managed to follow him somehow, despite their fatigue, fear giving them wings. Crunch, however, with his short legs, was panting, his tongue hanging out. Reportedly, cats sleep more than 20 hours a day. Even if the black tomcat had been able to enjoy a short nap during a Slail's speech, he was active since then. After a moment, they left the ferns and trees to reach a completely uncovered plain. There the grass was not so high and they had a clear view. The reverberation of the purple moons offered a satisfactory brightness, bathing the plain in a bloody glow. Jake refrained from wondering about why there were so many moons and their so abnormal color, his attention already monopolized by the group of digesters on their footsteps. Armed and prepared, the trio waited patiently for the monsters to leave the forest to hunt them. Even Crunch had his claws out. At first, the shrill cackling became louder and louder, then suddenly it was silence. At that very moment, 14 creatures nonchalantly emerged from the woods, their muffled footsteps reflecting their wariness. They had seen the corpses of their fellow monsters. More than the number, what warned Jake was the 2 huge silver monsters following them. They were as big, if not bigger, than the first one he had encountered. The silver blood had almost healed his ribs and he was not afraid to face them again. Unfortunately, there were not just 1 but 2, not counting the 14 other digesters that preceded them. It would be a tough battle. What do we do?" Amy asked, stuttering, as panic gradually took hold of her. "What we've done so far. We kill them. Or die trying." Jake replied coldly. Even if he had to go down, he would at least make them pay dearly. Hearing these words, Amy grew even paler if that were possible, but at least she stopped shaking. She had accepted the situation and what she had to do. Fight, and survive to laugh about it. Will was no different. Jake's words resonated in his mind, awakening a fighting instinct he didn't think he had. Putting his glasses back on in his trademark gesture, he warned himself, focusing his attention on one of the monsters. After a short moment when silence reigned supreme on the plain, a long, shrill cackling sound was heard and the peace was broken. Jake, who had originally planned to keep his ether, decided he could not afford to be thrifty. He immediately invested his 6 ether points to increase his ether agility by 3 points, bringing it to 16. With the 15.5 of his body agility, his effective agility was 24.8. Agility directly improved his reaction time, reflexes, balance, dexterity, precision and body control. This was the reason why despite his lack of firearms training, he could still hit the bullseye every time. More strength could have a decisive impact, but if he inadvertently reacted too late, he was finished. Then the monsters charged and Jake aimed and fired. In less than 5 seconds, the magazine of his gun was empty and the bodies of 12 of the 14 digesters were on the ground, each with a bullet in their head. Amy and Will held their breath as they watched, then jumped up and down with joy when they saw that only 4 were left. Even Jake was stunned by his accuracy. Maybe a marksman could do the same thing, but with a technique as poor as his. Not so sure. I'll leave the 2 little ones with you. I'll take care of the big 2. Good luck. Jake announced, before throwing himself into the fray, Crunch on his heels. Amy and Will swallowed, each picked a monster, then took turns yelling for courage. Not having time to reload his weapon, Jake dropped it, grabbing 2 of his knives. They knew that these digesters were much tougher than the others and that unless they aimed at their eyes, it would be very difficult to seriously hurt them. He waited until he was less than 5 meters away before throwing his projectiles. One of them hit the target and pierced the eye of one of the monsters. However, the second one turned its metal arms into a circular shield, thwarting the projectile aimed at it. Ignoring the blind digester, Jake took advantage of the fact that the other creature couldn't see him behind his shields to strike with all his might with his machete at its lower abdomen. The monster didn't react in time and his stroke hit its target. However, his joy was short-lived, as the creature was more resistant than he imagined. From a slash to the waist that would have easily sliced a normal human being in half, only a thin gash marked the digester's leathery skin. The silvery blood of the creature barely spilled, showing no sign of weakening. Changing tactics, Jake immediately opted for a wear and tear tactic, psychologically prepared for a long fight. Crunch did the same, lacerating the back legs of the blind digester non-stop, which roared with frustration and pain in response. Meanwhile, Will and Amy faced their respective monsters. Amy was struggling against a paralyzing terror, but every time the monster's blades approached her head, she remembered that she didn't want to die and found the will to move again. As she retreated backwards, avoiding the creature's attacks, she eventually reached a creek, which caused her to lose her balance. The contact with the water and the moss caught her off guard. Before she had time to realize what was happening to her, the digester was on her, its sides a few centimeters away from splitting her skull. Miraculously, Providence gave her a chance, a unique chance. The monster slipped on the same moss-covered stone that had caused her to fall, and slumped into the stream, splashing the young woman from head to toe. Realizing that such an opportunity would probably never come again, Amy hastily picked up her saber and brought it down on the monster's neck. Unfortunately, she wasn't strong enough to decapitate the monster's head at the first blow, but it was enough to sever part of the monster's spinal cord, which lost all ability to move. Enjoying her victory, the young woman uttered a beastly cry, and then struck with her saber again, repeating the same gesture over and over again until the monster's head was detached. "You filthy, fucking monster. You're not so smart, are you?" She spat, insisting on every word with a big saber stroke. After a while, when the digester looked like a bloody mush, she dropped her weapon, realizing the butchery she had perpetrated. At that precise moment, she burst into tears, before throwing herself into the stream, rubbing with water the dried blood of the monster that covered her to the point of tearing her skin. Then after a few minutes, she stopped struggling. She came out of the water and lay down in the grass, emptied of all emotion. She had accepted that it was the monster or her. All she had done was defend her life. She had nothing to blame herself for. When she realized this, she laughed. It was a laugh of pure happiness. A heart-warming laugh. The laughter of a beggar falling on a gold ingot. The laughter of a drowning girl breathing a breath of fresh air. The laughter of a blind woman seeing again. The laughter of a paraplegic walking for the first time. The laughter of a thirsty woman finding fresh water. The laughter of a hungry woman enjoying her favorite food. Quite simply, the laughter of a living person. Will, on the other hand, showed a composure that surprised even him. When the digester came upon him, he imitated Jake's gestures. He focused on an opening in the monster's guard and struck with all his might. The monster backed off to protect its liver, but Will immediately followed suit while the creature was thrown off balance by aiming for its throat. The digester dodged in time, but not completely, and one of its carotid arteries was severed, the silvery blood gushing out. However, Will was also too slow and one of the scythes crashed into his right lung as he injured his victim, leaving him as miserable as the monster. After a few seconds the monster's agony came to an end and a mass of ether appeared above the body. The debilitating pain prevented him from rejoicing. He slid slowly to the ground, his vision gradually blurring. Strangely, he felt no regret as he felt his end approaching. He had done his best to survive, and he had already avenged himself. Unfortunately, as his lung filled with blood, his breaths became shallower and jerkier, until finally the world began to turn around him and lost its light. Chapter 47 First Aid. You are listening at novelfull.audio. As Amy and Will's battles had come to an end, there was another that was nearing its climax. The attrition tactic Jake had adopted had proven to be an excellent choice. However, the digester had proven to be far more resilient and intelligent than in his wildest scenarios, to the point that he himself looked no better than the monster facing him. Indeed, this digester was not like the others. Although slower, it had no decisive weaknesses and could quickly change the shape of its arms to suit the situation. It never rushed, maintaining a defensive posture. This forced Jake to focus his forces on areas he would have called the creature's greatest strengths, prolonging the confrontation beyond what he thought was possible. The creature was gasping for breath, countless cuts all over its body. Its tail had been severed and one arm was missing. As for its remaining shield arm, it was cracked and seemed inert, hanging along the monster's body. The white glow in his eye was flickering faintly, while his one eyelid was gradually closing. Jake had almost bled him to death. His strength was almost gone too, and without the ether he had absorbed, he was convinced that he would have reached his breaking point long ago. The difference was minute, but the difference in stamina became more and more apparent as the battle progressed. When he felt like he was about to give in, a flow of vitality flowed through his body, giving him the boost he needed to keep fighting. Without his new agility, he would never have been able to avoid each blow for so long. The creature wasn't absurdly fast, but still fast enough to require his full concentration. And yet with 24.8 agility, it was as if its movements were more than twice as slow as it should be in his eyes. It could only be imagined for a normal human. But this time the moment had come to end it all. The monster was on the verge of losing consciousness and no longer had the strength to raise his remaining arm to defend himself. Jake distanced himself, patiently waiting to catch his breath, trying to ignore the cries of the second blind digester, who was wriggling not far from him. The pain must have been truly unbearable to have kept it from joining the fight for so long. Naturally, it hadn't occurred to him that his lazy cat was a notorious torturer, loving to play with his helpless prey. Usually it was mice, but since the digester mouse the retired stray cat had had to curb his instincts. So what if this mouse was a little bigger? Finally, Jake sprang up, the machete pulled back against him, with the tip aimed at the creature's half-closed eye. A second later, it was over. The machete pierced the eye and then the skull of his opponent with full force, sending it straight into a world of endless night. The creature twisted once, a mass of ether appeared over its corpse and it was over. With a sigh of relief, Jake ignored the ether and walked towards the blind digester. Dumbstruck, he discovered Crunch playfully mistreating his victim, who probably had too much pain in its eye to bother with the cat scratches. Unceremoniously, Jake thrust his blade into the monster's punctured eye, and after 2 jolts, the monster passed away, another stream of ether appearing on its carcass. This time he absorbed the ether via compress. He also collected the ether from the other digesters that had been slaughtered. Remembering that he had left Amy and Will to their fate, he wondered how they were doing. Sweeping the plain around him, he eventually found Will's body next to the remains of a digester. The monster had been dead for a long time, but Will was also in bad shape. Maybe even dead already. Checking his pulse, he was able to disprove his theory. The pulse was weak, but Will was still alive. With the scythe still in place, he realized his right lung was slowly filling with blood. On the other hand, the scythe prevented the hemorrhage from spreading. Blood in the trachea and he would have choked to death. His breathing was congested and his face and extremities were cyanotic from lack of oxygen. If he did nothing, Will would die within minutes. Thinking about the possible solutions, Jake saw only one viable one. Digging through his pack, he took out his first aid kit, as well as several vials of blood from the first digester he'd encountered, which was probably far more effective than the blood from the smaller ones. He forced Will to drink the contents of the vials before promptly removing the scythe belonging to the monster's arm. He applied pressure with sterile compresses to the large damaged veins and arteries, then withdrew the blood, filling the lung with a syringe and catheter for blood donations, which he connected to an empty bag. Jake was truly prepared for any situation. He filled a blood bag that way. When the lung had been emptied of most of his blood, he connected the bag to another tube and catheter, then after tapping to remove the air bubbles, he pricked the cephalic vein in Will's arm to infuse it with his own blood. Luckily, Will's veins were exposed, so he managed to do without a tourniquet. With the infusion in place, he took out a needle clamp and suture thread and began to patch up the man in the suit. His new agility gave him incredible dexterity for someone who had only practiced on meat and some fruit. Jake wasn't a doctor, although the Oracle had made him eat more books than he wanted on the subject. Even if he had advanced notions of first aid, he would have considered this situation hopeless under any other circumstances. Especially because this kind of operation required an aseptic environment and sterile instruments. However, with the blood of the digesters, he was able to maintain his optimism. The boost in vitality and constitution multiplied the chances of survival. A few minutes after ingesting the silvery blood, Will had already lost his cyanotic complexion and his breathing was gradually regaining amplitude. One of his lungs was still functional, so as long as the bleeding from the punctured lung was stopped he had a good chance of recovering. In a healthy person, the blood coagulated in 4 to 8 minutes on a small notch. Heavier injuries like these naturally took longer, but with the stats boost and biodegradable sutures, Will's condition eventually stabilized. It would take him several days to recover, even if he consumed the blood of these monsters. Maybe he'd have sequelae, but at least he was out of the woods. This new world offered 1,001 ways to die, but it also gave them the means to survive. A ruthless but fair world. The ether in B-842's atmosphere was also almost twice as concentrated as on Earth. It would take days or even weeks for their ether stats to change significantly, but the little ether absorbed had greatly improved Will's vitality. When Jake thought of all his actions devoid of indecision, he couldn't help but think how mysterious the Oracle paths were. He had followed them without flinching to increase his chances of survival, cramming everything he was told to learn. Even when he was treating Will a few minutes earlier, he was instinctively mimicking his shadow guide. The irony was that only a few months later he was applying all that survival knowledge, but to save someone else's life. Aside from bandaging his wounds after his morning fight, he had survived that night's battle completely unscathed. With Will's survival assured, he went back to his pack and set out to find Amy. He found her several hundred meters away, lying in the grass near a stream, asleep. Her face was peaceful, as if the horrors of the day had never happened. Not wishing to wake her, he covered her with his sleeping bag, before returning to work on the digester's dissection. The experiment had proved that their blood was useful, and he intended to vamp them down to the marrow before they had shed their last drop. A twinge in his heart seized him as he thought of all that wasted blood. The plane had been repainted in silver last night, and there would surely be many more such as this one. Chapter 48 Campfire Barbecue. You are listening at novelfull.audio. A few hours later, Jake wiped his sweaty forehead with a satisfied grin. All of his vials were full, and at one point he had even chosen to fill one of his 2 bottles with blood. It was past midnight. He had noticed that digester blood wasn't clotting, or at least it didn't seem to be clotting now. The blood was somehow alive, but frozen in the state in which the digester was dead. The meat was also cut into rather thin slices and wrapped in cellophane paper, but if he hoped to keep it longer, he would have to salt it, dry it and smoke it. He didn't like the idea of starting a fire in the middle of nowhere, but at least he couldn't hear any more shrill cackle. He might not get that chance again. Returning to the forest to collect wood, from which they had just escaped, he took the opportunity to take a good shit. It's never mentioned enough in survival stories, but the adrenaline rush during a fight speeded up the intestinal transit. And in a wild environment where ferocious beasts were roaming around, it was better to seize the opportunity when it arose. Jake came back a few moments later, near the abandoned meat, took a look at Will and Amy to make sure everything was all right, and then got to work. A quarter of an hour later, a vigorous fire lit up and warmed the plain. Using longer branches and string, he made a spit, or rather a hanger, which he used to suspend the slices of silver meat, which he did not forget to salt generously beforehand. The taste probably wouldn't be great, but at least he wouldn't have to worry about starving to death in the days to come. When he had smoked and dried enough meat, he dismantled and reassembled his spit to bring it closer to the fire and started roasting the rest of the meat. As far as seasoning was concerned, he had found several rosemary bushes on the way, which he had cheerfully plucked. There was no way of knowing if this rosemary came from the earth, but it looked, tasted and smelled just the same. Taking a frying pan out of his pack, he then tried to stir-fry the strange pink potato-like tubers he had discovered earlier. Half an hour later, the meal was ready. The meat turned out to be better than anything he had ever eaten before, and for an upstart like him who had been buying only the highest quality for 3 months, this was no small compliment. He even wondered how such delicious meat could belong to such a monstrous and repulsive creature. In the end, he concluded that nature had its own justice. In addition to being delicious, he felt his tiredness fade and his vigor grow as his stomach filled up. The sautéed, pink potatoes were also excellent, tasting like the sweet potatoes of the earth. They also gave him a strange energy that made him feel more alert, more awake. Curious, he consulted his status with the help of the bracelet, and the result baffled him. His ether vitality and intelligence were both significantly boosted. His vitality had doubled, while his intelligence had gained 1 point. These bonuses seemed to be temporary, but their effects on metabolism and alertness far exceeded those of coffee. By the way, blood tripled ether vitality for several hours, if consumed immediately after the digester's death. This morning's digester's blood only doubled it. The effect seemed to diminish with time. If he drank it regularly, he had a combined vitality between 76.4 and 51, which explained the rapid healing of his ribs and cuts, combined with his constitution. As for the nutritional values, strictly speaking, even the most advanced GMO strains, early 22nd century, not 21st century, could not claim this result. The saying, "You are what you eat," also applied to the rules of this world. Anything that had been permeated or born of ether probably had the same energizing effects. The only surprising thing was that he had already tasted these potatoes when he first discovered them, and the effects didn't seem so incredible. Maybe the cooking had something to do with it. Or the amount ingested. It gave his cooking skill a new perspective. He'd long wondered why areas like informatics, which he considered himself professionally qualified in, were only entitled to the proverbial, "You're not a novice anymore." Aside from trivial skills that you could do/not do, which capped out at 50 points, anything below that was considered novice proficiency. Jake was now really curious to taste a dish prepared by a master as judged by the Oracle system. Now that he finally had a moment's respite to settle down, he took the opportunity to check the latest system notifications. After the previous battle, his authority level had been promoted to rank 2, 23/600/100,000, with the grade of private. According to these observations and Shi's confirmation, this did not bring him any particular perks. The reason was as follows. The Oracle Overseer had prematurely unlocked the Ether Vision function to assist them on B842. As a result, the expected reward for his promotion had been delivered in advance. As for the military rank itself, a private had no particular authority over the recruits and other civilians LVL0. This was also the case in a conventional army on Earth, unless they were invested with a new authority such as under martial law. Both recruits and privates were merely pawns obeying a superior officer. The only difference was the standing. According to Shi, however, it was not useless. It conferred certain advantages, especially during ordeals. Some taxes were also cheaper, including entry into the Oracle shelters. As for his ether storage, the harvest had been good. He had slaughtered 12 digesters LVL1 close to LVL2, while the 2 big ones that closed the march were near LVL3. Since the experience for raising the Oracle rank and the amount of ether of the digesters killed were correlated, he had therefore 23.6 more ether points, or 23.8 all in all. Confronting an entire pack of digesters made him realize that it was too risky to keep his ether to increase his intelligence or perception. Besides, it was also risky to use it for no reason. For example, if he came across a huge group of digesters that he couldn't defeat, great strength/speed wouldn't help him escape if those monsters were the tireless type. In such situations, increasing the constitution was the solution. More stamina, a tougher body, and a better tolerance to temperature and climate changes. Also, he would better withstand starvation and dehydration. The problem of vitality could be temporarily alleviated as long as he had some digester blood or meat at his disposal. In any case, despite the risks involved, Jake could not take this decision lightly. In the end, he opted to keep his ether again. If he got eaten before he could react, he probably would not have survived anyway with or without that ether. After his meal, Jake felt perfectly rested, even though he hadn't slept since his arrival on B842. The meat and pink pototes were simply incredible. Crunch was also extremely vigorous after its own meal. His pet had actively contributed to his dissection session. The black cat, who he would have sworn was somewhat bigger, was now gnawing on a digester bone like a dog would have done. Yet Jake did not have the chance to meditate further on the matter because at that point Amy joined him around the campfire. She had large dark circles under her eyes, but her expression indicated that at that moment she was mostly hungry. The smell of the roasted meat must have woken her up and drawn her here. "Help yourself," Jake said, in his usual nonchalant tone. "What kind of meat is this?" Amy asked, giving a suspicious glance at the spit. "Meat. Dot. Dot. I'll have some, if you don't mind," she finally replied, breaking the silence. "Please, help yourself," Jake replied, without loosening up one iota. Scrutinizing the roasted meat more closely, Amy's expression changed drastically. Scanning the corpses of the digesters, she noticed that one of them had been completely gutted and dismembered, and aside from the bones, there was not much left. Then noticing the dried and smoked meat in the cellophane, she understood where the roasted meat came from and displayed a sincere expression of repulsion. "What did you think?" "That I actually thought about bringing a roast beef when I was shipped here." "I'm sorry to disappoint you, I didn't," he retorted dismissively. Realizing the stupidity of her behavior, Amy felt shame overwhelming her, then pulling herself together, helped herself to the potatoes, which she placed on a disposable napkin that Jake had provided, and used the knife he lent her to carve herself a piece of meat. She stared at the meat for a long time before deciding to take the plunge. When the cut of meat landed on her tongue, her eyes suddenly popped out, and she began to eat voraciously. Chapter 49 The Farm. You are listening at novelfull.audio. How is it possible to be that good when that thing was so hideous? Amy exclaimed after devouring half of her meatloaf. I asked myself the same question. Those potatoes are delicious, too, and both meat and vegetables have miraculous effects on our bodies and ether. It's true that I feel extraordinarily well, as if my tiredness is going away. It's very likely. Your dark circles are coming off. Jake confirmed, staring at her attentively. You know, that's not a very smart comment to make to a pretty young woman. Amy pouted. But it's the truth. Not funny. They finished their meal in silence, Jake not hesitating to help himself to enjoy the unexpected effects of his dish again. When they were full, it was dawn and the suns replaced the moons. The oracle bracelet also gave the time, so he could tell that the nights were short, which was not to displease him. The dawn was already rising when it was only 4:00 in the morning. In the end, he hadn't slept, but he felt fine. Same with Amy. Next, he checked Will's condition, and was able to validate the miraculous effectiveness of Digester's blood. Will's wound was almost healed, the scab peeling off at this spot, leaving a smooth pink skin like that of a newborn baby. Will was breathing peacefully and his skin had regained its color. In fact, he was asleep. While he thought it would take several days with the silvery blood for Will to fully heal, a few hours had been enough. The lung had probably not yet healed and Will should probably moderate his ardor during the next few days. Nevertheless, if he drank Digester blood regularly, who knows, he might be cured faster than expected. Believing they should be back on the road soon, Jake gently shook Will, trying to wake him up as quietly as possible. He had explained his condition to Amy, and behind his shoulder Amy glanced anxiously at the convalescent. His worries turned out to be unfounded. The businessman suddenly opened his eyes, and his gaze was sharp and alert. He seemed perfectly awake. I survived. Will asked no one in particular, with a dubious look on his face. Yes, but it was close. Jake explained. Next time, try not to get your lung impaled by one of those things. Did you save me? You could say that. Although the credit goes to the blood of those monsters and the ether in the atmosphere. At this point, you could almost call it a healing potion. Extra. I mean for being alive, not for drinking alien blood. Will justified himself, realizing that his enthusiasm was somewhat excessive for someone returning from beyond the grave. However, now that you're better, I'd like to get back on the road. Jake announced, breaking the brief complicity between the duo. There's food by the fire. Don't forget to soak up the ether from the Digester you defeated, so you didn't almost die for nothing. You too, Amy. The two companions nodded with embarrassment, especially Amy who hadn't really been hurt and had really forgotten to absorb her victim's ether. After defeating a Digester, Amy and Will had finally been promoted to rank 1 recruits, and could now absorb the ether as well. Jake reminded them of the absorption procedure and how to store it if they wanted to, and then let them experience what he said for themselves. He also explained the benefits and risks of absorbing ether directly. None of them took this step. A moment later, all the ether had been stored and Will stared lovingly at the Digester's roasted meat, which was kept at the right temperature by the embers of the dying fire. He, too, had never tasted anything so delicious. Jake explained again to him and Amy the effect of the dish on their bodies and ether before finally getting back on the road. They quickly crossed the plain to penetrate a new wood, this time of conifers, with less dense vegetation and little tall grass, which was not to displease them. This meant less risk of ambush by the Digesters, but also less discretion in doing their business. Amy had walked several hundred meters to pee behind a tree for fear of being heard. So, if a Digester attacked her, she would have been screwed. When the sun was high in the sky, they fell in the heart of the woods on a group of intact buildings surrounded by wooden enclosures. A farm. The main building must have been the residential part, but a barn, a stable and a henhouse could easily be distinguished from their position. As they approached, they saw other pens, and with undisguised astonishment. Animals. Many animals. The hens were clucking, the roosters were crowing, the sheep were bleating, the cows were bellowing, the rabbits were yelping. In all, several hundred animals squealing and struggling in their cages and pens, probably locked up since being teleported by the World Eater. Jake was debating the odds of spending the night on B-842 without any of these animals being devoured by digesters, despite the ruckus they were making. Perhaps the digesters perceived a threat in the number of animals in the farm and chose to ignore them. No way. However, as he approached one of the pens, he noticed that most of them were actually open. Most of the pens were partially empty despite the large number of animals remaining. It was easy to explain. The animals also had an oracle device. Those that had more advanced survival instincts, were more intelligent or bold, had escaped at the first opportunity. The rest of the cattle, too conditioned or too used to the farm to leave on their own, had stayed behind. As they moved forward, they recognized the stretch of dirt road that was to lead to the settlement. It had been cut clean a few meters after it left the farm, and there should have been, according to Jake, many more animals and pens than that initially. He was sure of this because one of the buildings was missing half of its structure and the section was so clean that it was troubling. The animals, probably pigs, given the nature of the pen, had long ago vacated the premises, free from their prison. Be no calm. Unfortunately, perhaps it would have been better for them to have remained locked up, for on their way the group had neither seen nor heard a single pig. They could only hope for them to have gone in a different direction. Once in front of the most spacious building, Jake picked the lock of the residence, a large ivy-covered stone house. With the shutters open, they discovered a large, perfectly maintained living room. The parquet flooring was shiny, the furniture was modern and sober, contrary to what one might have expected from a farmhouse lost in the woods, and an imposing wall-mounted flat screen faced an equally imposing dark leather sofa. A fragrance of orange blossom gently attacked their nostrils, indicating that the housework had been done very recently. However, the house was empty. The only explanation the group could think of was that the residents were not at home when the farm was moved, or that they were in the other part of the farm. The last hypothesis, not insignificant, was that they had gone exploring and that the digesters had dealt with them, otherwise they would have come back to look after the animals. Besides, the racket coming from the pens was mainly due to the thirst and hunger of the animals, since as they had noticed in passing, the watering and feeding troughs were empty. Considering the residents as dead or permanently missing, Jake undertook to rob the property of everything that could be useful to him during their journey. Will and Amy, see if you can find any backpacks or hiking gear. If you find anything handy in your size, don't get emotional, understand? Jake ordered, in a serious tone. They made an indignant expression, but in the end they nodded and began to look for something that might be of practical use to them. After all, they had survived a hellish night, and they were well aware that without Jake's equipment, they would already be dead. On top of that, they felt more than a little guilty when they saw Jake carrying his huge package alone without asking them anything. Meanwhile, Jake went through the drawers one by one looking for strings and duct tape, the two resources he had almost run out of the day before and thought he might have to use again someday. Eventually he found the tape, but no traces of rope or string. He then went to the kitchen, where he sorted the food according to what could be preserved for a long time or not. Naturally, everything that ran on electricity was unusable and the fresh produce inside the refrigerator had already started to rot, especially meat and fish. Nevertheless, he found enough canned goods to enrich his variety of food, even though under normal circumstances he would have had to pay for it to accept eating canned cassoulet or sauerkraut. But the situation being what it was, he did not intend to be a picky eater.